Hello, everyone.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking all about communication, why it's important, why you should be open to it, and how to facilitate deeper communication in your relationship.
But of course, before we do that, please hit that like button and of course, hit the subscribe button, because you know when you hit the subscribe button, it makes me smile.
And if you want to get bonus content, support the channel further, links to our YouTube memberships as well as Patreon is down below. We have a ton of content over on Patreon to help you dive into the topic of domestic discipline.
So this topic of communication, something that's, I would say, as old as any relationship, right?
And we have done a lot of topics on communication. Like, we've talked about the importance of communication over and over and over again, but we have kind of a new take on why you really do want to have communication in your relationship.
Yeah, and where does that fall in a domestic discipline relationship? I think that's the big question that we want to answer for you guys.
That is a good question, because when you have domestic discipline, when you have a relationship that's built on a hierarchy where one person has authority over the other and one person is really responsible to come under that authority, and that's the expectation, it kind of blurs the lines of how does effective communication really look in those types of relationships. Because I think that if you look at other examples of communication or in relationships, it's all based on this premise that both people have an equal say, and that you need to always come to some sort of mutual compromise, where that may or may not be appropriate in your domestic discipline relationship, kind of depending on how you approach certain topics and certain structures within your relationship. That's going to look different, and it's not always going to be based on compromise and based on coming to a mutual decision. At some point, the head of household is going to have to kind of pull rank, assert their authority, and have the final say on those decisions.
I think you hit the nail on the head, though, by saying really the first thing is that communication does have a place in the domestic discipline relationship. But like you said, the key there is that as you go along in that communication, whatever it is that you're talking about, we've talked about this on the podcast before, that if it comes down to a deadlocked vote, I get 2 votes. And that's the way that it's structured. But that doesn't mean that communication doesn't happen at all. And that's why I think it's very important to point out what you just did, that communication first and foremost does in fact happen in a domestic discipline relationship. And I would even go as far as saying it should happen in a domestic discipline relationship, wouldn't you?
I agree, because when you are in domestic discipline, there's a high level of trust that has to be facilitated. And that trust really is built through communication. And as a taken in hand, I need to know that my head of household knows my perspectives. They know what I need from the relationship so that they can make more informed decisions, so that I can have the confidence and the trust that their decisions really are in my best interest.
And that same token, I think one of the biggest misconceptions in a domestic discipline relationship when it comes to communication is that the taken in hand has no say. And that is not the way the communication or the domestic discipline relationship happens at all. In fact, if you remember, and many of you who have been with us from the very, very beginning, or can go back into some of the recent podcasts that we've done, we have talked about the importance that this whole relationship started for many of us because our taken in hands came to us and said, I think this would be good for our relationship. So that came out of a communication with your taken in hand. So the point being is that all of the things that you have set up were first mutually agreed upon by the taken in hand first. And so that's why the reason I want to point that out is because if that's the way the relationship started, and I'm pretty sure that it did for the majority of us, then why would you then throw that away in the middle of a domestic discipline relationship, right?
And even if it was the head of household that came to the taken in hand with this idea of domestic discipline, however that started, it started with a conversation. It started with mutual communication of you sharing with each other your thoughts and your perspectives on this topic, on this subject, so that you could come into a structure of how this is going to look, how it's going to work. It all started with communication, regardless of whose idea it was, regardless of who brought the information to whom. You still had to have that conversation. You still had to have that communication. And so as you are developing your domestic discipline from the beginning into just continuing to develop your systems as you go along, there needs to be this open dialogue, because you can't necessarily develop systems if you are not communicating with each other. If you don't know what's working and what's not for the other person, especially as a head of household, you need to know what's working for your taken in hand and what really isn't being beneficial at all. And so you need to be kind of open to that feedback.
Again, I think that's an excellent point that you just made, because one of the things that you need to strive for, and head of households, I'm going to talk to you just for a moment. One of the things that you need to strive for, and that we've always talked about on here, is one of your big purposes as the head of household is to make her life better. Well, how do you make her life better? Well, first of all, you take a lot of pressure of decision making that she doesn't need to be making off of her plate. But also, one of the reasons you establish rules is because she's come to you to be a better person. She wants to be a better wife, a better mother, a better person. So how are you going to help her with those goals if you never talk to her? If you never ask if you're doing a good job in holding her accountable to the rules that she's asked for you to hold her to? How am I doing? Am I communicating effectively? Am I setting goals and being clear about what those goals are so that you can accomplish them? And if not, how do I change it? What do I need to do better? How do I need to communicate better in order to help us achieve that goal as a leader? That's how the good leaders approach it, wouldn't you say?
I think one of the things that you hit on is that you want to help your taken in hand reach their goals. Now, I think that it's very important to know that as a head of household, you get to decide what the goals are.
Yes.
You get to decide what the priorities are. And so if you have things that you want your taken in hand to work on that maybe isn't their idea, that's okay too. Like, it's okay for you to say, this is what I want from you. And you don't necessarily need them to give a lot of input in that structure building. But it's also important to see where they are. What are their struggles? What are their goals? So that you can start to incorporate some of those things as well. I know that for us, there are certain things that Coda actually doesn't necessarily care about that much. But he knows that they are systems that if I don't accomplish them, it unravels and it affects other areas of our relationship and of our home that he does care about. So he holds me accountable to things that are my goals because he knows that ultimately it's the best decision for our household.
And not only that, that is all absolutely correct. But the second thing I would say too is that some of those goals, it makes her unravel as a person. It makes her feel like she's a failure or not accomplishing something that she really has set out. So even though that may not be something that I'm thinking, I don't see that as a big a deal, it is to her. And so she wants me to hold her to that so that she can feel accomplished as well. And so the point of this is to say, having a dialogue like that with your taken in hand is really important, because again, how will you know if you are helping them achieve their goals and that ultimately you're accomplishing the goals that you have set for the head of household if you never have a conversation about it. And you might be finding, I think the biggest thing that you will find as well, at least I've found in our dynamic, is when that communication is not happening enough and effectively, you're having to correct a lot. You're having to punish a lot. And that really, I think, is a way, the reason that's happening is because you're taken in hand. That's the only way they're getting communication. That's the only way they're finding a connection with you to try to say, hey, something's wrong here. That's when the flag needs to go up and say, maybe the correction and punishment is happening a lot, not because they're necessarily being a bad person, but because there's something that needs a correction here. They don't know exactly what it is, but we need to have a conversation about it after the correction and punishment. I'm not saying in place of. Always follow through with that. But that sometimes those can be the symptoms of the overall problem.
I think that one thing that is really important is to understand that behavior is a form of communication. So if your taken in hand doesn't feel heard, if they don't feel like they can come to you with a conversation, if they don't feel like they can come to you and communicate their needs, that will come out in their behavior. And that's not always a conscious thing. In fact, I would say most of the time it's subconscious. But just like I was saying, that there are certain things that I've asked Kodo to hold me accountable to, because I know that when I feel out of control in some areas, that does affect how well I can respect him, how well I can manage my emotions, how well I can manage my other responsibilities. The things that are very, very important to Koda. He wants my respect. He wants my obedience. He wants me to manage my responsibilities well. And so when we were having a lot of issues with that, that's when I was able to finally kind of put the pieces together. And then I was able to come to him and say, look, when you don't hold me accountable to these smaller, seemingly more insignificant routines and habits, that affects how I view your leadership, and that affects how I'm able to respect you. Now, is it still my job to respect him? Absolutely. So that does not negate the accountability aspect there, but just to say, like, to be able to come to him and say, hey, I figured this out. I figured out something that's happening inside of me. And here is kind of like the magic formula, if you will, of how my brain is working right now. And so I want you to have this information so that then you can make decisions with that information of how to help me be the taken in hand that you want me and need me to be.
And believe it or not, those have been the most helpful conversations I've ever gotten. Because a light bulb usually goes off like, oh, that's the reason X has been happening. That's the reason I need to do Y. And those have always been good to bring us closer together, I think, to help us accomplish the goals that we've set out to do. And so that's why this is important, is that as human beings, and especially in a marriage relationship, a taken in hand head of household relationship, that's the most important communication, I think, that you should have, because this is the most important relationship of your life. And so if you're just saying, you know what, we're never going to communicate, and I'm just going to assume that I'm right all the time, that's not exactly the way that I would go about those kinds of things.
Because just because you're in a place of authority and you're in a place of decision making doesn't mean that you are all-knowing. And it doesn't mean that you have the information to make the right decisions all the time unless you're facilitating that communication. Now, I would say that I prefer, as a taken in hand, I really do prefer when that communication is requested and facilitated by my head of household.
True.
I really do like when Koda will come to me and ask questions, when he will prompt those conversations, when he initiates that communication. It's very helpful for me to be able to open up.
And she will be the first to tell you that is something that we've worked very, very hard on in our relationship, but I have worked hard on. That is not my natural inclination to want to do is to come to her and ask questions. I am definitely kind of a typical guy in that way, from the standpoint that I just feel like, hey, if I think everything seems to be right on the perimeter, everything must be good. So I think I'm getting better. I don't think I've achieved it yet, but I do try more often to come to her and ask questions and, believe it or not, almost get an evaluation. Like,
you'll ask me how I feel like you're doing as far as holding accountability and doing things like that, and to make sure that you're not missing things, because there have been times where you're like, you feel like you've held me accountable really well that week, and I was like, well, actually, felt like I was disrespectful here, and you didn't say anything. So there's been times where those conversations have had to happen too, but you also evaluate where I'm at.
yes,
And
very good point.
You let me know where you think that I have done well and where I need to improve. And sometimes, you have told me, looking back on this week, I should have offered more correction. I should have potentially had more conversations with you, because these things really weren't okay, and they shouldn't have been let go. And so you really evaluate how you've done for yourself. You ask me those questions, you evaluate how I've done, and then you ask me if there's anything that I need to share with you.
Yes.
And I think the best way to have those conversations is to have specific times set aside.
That's true.
I think that when you're in these like power differential type of relationships where you have authority structures, you don't want to have these conversations kind of be ongoing, because it can come off as undermining the head of household's authority.
True.
If I was coming to Coda like every single day with something, it would make him feel disrespected, that I just don't trust his authority, and that I'm just not like leaning into obeying him and obeying his authority. He would not like that, would kind of undermine what we're trying to build here. And so having specific set aside times where it's like, okay, I know that twice a week, once a week, even every day. Sometimes we've had daily check-ins, but it's at a specific time.
Yes.
So I know, okay, I'm going to get to have my conversation. I'm going to be able to bring up the points that I've been thinking about, or the concepts I've been considering and thinking about, and all these things going through my mind. I can bring those up during the check-in time. And that's what we call it. We call it a check-in, and we've done them daily.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we've ever done them less often than once a week.
Yeah, no, nothing I'm aware of. No.
And so, yeah, to facilitate communication, it's really important to have those set aside times to have these conversations. And
if any of you at this point may be saying, I shouldn't have to have those check-ins, she just needs to obey and do such and such, here's the problem with that. We've talked a lot about on these podcasts that this dynamic, yes, does have certain people in certain roles, but there can get to a point where you have a dictatorship. So be very, very careful. Yes, we don't want to go, and Aria has already talked about this, we don't want the pendulum to go way over to where we started before domestic discipline, where there's seems to be that everything has to be negotiated and everything has to be agreed upon between two. But the tendency can be, if you're not careful, is for the pendulum to swing the other direction, to where your taken in hand head of household feels like she has no say at all, and meaning that, okay, I'm following all the rules, I'm trying to do all this kind of thing, but he's never asking me if we're accomplishing the goals that I need for myself, and also for, am I even accomplishing the goals that he set for me? Because he never talks to me about it. He never asks me if things need to be clarified so that I know that I'm on the right track. And that's where this is important. This has nothing to do with usurping somebody else's authority or anything like that. This is simply trying to sit down and have a conversation, and as we're saying, almost like I look at it as like a post-game wrap-up, is you're looking to say, okay, what's going well and what needs to be fixed. Okay, now that we've talked about it, now it's on me as the head of household to make sure that those are made, that she's made them, and now that she's following through with them. And that still falls within what we're talking about.
You don't want your taken in hand to be afraid to ask questions, especially clarifying questions where, if Coda makes a request of me, or if he tells me how things are going to be, I need to be able to ask those clarifying questions to say, just so I'm understanding, this is what I think you're telling me. Am I correct in my understanding of what you are setting here? I need to be able to do that, because without the ability to ask questions, without the ability to offer feedback, it's going to make me feel like Coda doesn't care about taking care of me.
That's the key. And
having a level of care is something that's really important to me. Like, I want to feel taken care of in my relationship, and I want to know that Coda is making decisions not only for our relationship, not only for our family, but he's making decisions based on what is best for me, my growth, my emotional needs. And the only way he can do that is if he's having conversations with me to know what those are.
And I'm sure that makes you feel more secure.
It absolutely does.
Which is the ultimate goal that you probably want to feel. You want to feel secure in our dynamic and our relationship and everything that we're doing, right? And again, head of households, you can relate to this. There's nothing worse than a boss telling you to do something, you go do it, and then they get upset that you did it the way that you told them, and it's because they didn't clarify. They didn't actually get specific. And maybe that may have been a little on you to not ask for specifics, but again, that's the point of this conversation that we're trying to have. So she can ask for specifics, she can clarify, so that she can absolutely make sure she's doing it the way that you want. And again, that analogy with a boss, I know many of you can relate to that, because that has happened over and over to me, which makes me think that's not the kind of leader that I want to be. That's not the kind of head of household that I want to be. And that's not the kind of husband that I want to be. And so that's why this is so important to have this dialogue in your relationship.
All right, guys, I hope that conversation was helpful. I hope that you got something out of it. Definitely just hopefully you can take this concept of having more conversations, more dialogue in your domestic discipline to heart, and you can really evaluate, is that something that you need to develop further, or is that something that you're doing really well? So anyway, hope you enjoyed this podcast. Let us know what you thought down below, and we will talk to you next time.
See you later.